Your mother is possessed by demons, and we need to perform an immediate intervention. The words hung in the hospital room like a physical presence. I stared at my son, Marcus, standing at the foot of my bed with his hands clasped in front of him, his expression serene, in a way that terrified me more than any diagnosis could. Behind him stood 3 people I'd never seen before, all wearing matching silver crosses on their chests. My cardiologist had just left 15 minutes ago. I'd been admitted to Mercy General Hospital 3 days earlier after collapsing at the grocery store. The tests showed what my doctor, Dr. Patel, called significant cardiac irregularities requiring immediate intervention. He'd scheduled me for a cardiac catheterization procedure to place stents. It was serious but manageable. People had these procedures every day. I'd be home in a week. But Marcus had other ideas. The doctors don't understand what's really happening, he continued, his voice carrying the smooth certainty of someone who'd practiced these words many times. The symptoms you're experiencing, the chest pain, the shortness of breath, the confusion, these are manifestations of spiritual corruption. Our church has seen this before. I tried to sit up, but my chest tightened with the effort. The monitors beside my bed beeped steadily, tracking every physiological change. I'd been a nurse for 37 years before I retired. I understood cardiac disease. I understood medical science. What I didn't understand was how my son, whom I'd raised to think critically and question authority, had become this version of himself. Marcus, sweetheart, I need to rest before tomorrow's procedure, I said, keeping my voice steady despite the panic rising in my throat. The doctors have explained everything. I have blockages, real blockages. They're going to use real medicine to fix them. The woman to Marcus's left, thin, with severe blonde hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her skin, stepped forward. I'm Sister Evangeline. We've been praying for you since Marcus called us this morning. Your son has shown remarkable spiritual maturity in recognizing the demonic influence in his family. Demonic influence in his family. The implication landed like a stone in my stomach. My daughter, Cassandra, who lived in Seattle and hadn't spoken to Marcus in 2 years. My ex-husband, who'd remarried and moved to Arizona. My grandchildren, who called me every Sunday. All of us, apparently, carriers of spiritual corruption. I appreciate your concern, I said carefully, but I'm not interested in any alternative treatments. My doctor is excellent. The procedure is scheduled for tomorrow morning at 8. Marcus's face shifted. The serenity cracked slightly, revealing something harder underneath. You're not listening, Mother. The church has made this very clear. If you refuse spiritual intervention, you'll be accepting Satan's hold on your life. Is that what you want? To let him win? The question was designed to be unanswerable. Any refusal was automatically proof of demonic possession. Any agreement would validate his entire framework. I'd seen this logic before, in my years working with patients experiencing psychotic breaks. The self-sealing system. No escape hatch, no way to argue yourself out. I want to get well, I said simply, and I want to do that with medical treatment. Please, I need to rest now. But Marcus didn't leave. Instead, he pulled a chair close to my bed and sat down. Sister Evangeline and the 2 other church members, a man with intense eyes and a younger woman who kept glancing nervously between Marcus and me, remained standing in the corner, like sentries. I'm staying with you tonight, Marcus announced, to pray, to protect you from the darkness that's trying to claim you. I closed my eyes and felt something shift inside me. Not physically, spiritually, if I believed in such things. It was the moment when I realized my son had crossed a line from which there might be no return. The night was long. Marcus prayed aloud for hours, his voice rising and falling in patterns that seemed designed to hypnotize rather than comfort. The church members eventually left around midnight, but not before Sister Evangeline touched my forehead and whispered something in a language I didn't recognize. Marcus remained, sitting in the uncomfortable chair beside my bed, his eyes occasionally closing, but never staying closed for long. I didn't sleep. I lay in the darkness, listening to my son's prayers, feeling the weight of the monitors attached to my body, and trying to understand how we'd arrived at this moment. Marcus was 43 years old. He had a good job as an IT consultant. He'd been married once, divorced 5 years ago, and had seemed to be drifting without clear direction until he'd found his church 3 years ago. I'd been supportive at first. Everyone needed something to believe in. But gradually, the church had become everything. His apartment walls were covered with religious imagery. His social media was filled with testimonies about spiritual warfare. His friendships outside the church had dwindled to nothing. I'd mentioned my concerns to Cassandra during one of our phone calls. She'd been more direct. "He's in a cult, Mom. An actual cult. They're isolating him, controlling his thoughts, and now they're using him to isolate you too. You need to be very careful with him." I hadn't wanted to believe that. He was my son, the boy I'd raised alone after his father left, the child who'd brought me drawings from kindergarten and held my hand during his school plays. Surely that boy was still in there somewhere. But sitting in that hospital room, listening to his prayers, I wasn't so sure. The next morning, I was supposed to have my cardiac catheterization. Dr. Patel arrived at 7:30 to do final prep work. She was a small woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and an efficient manner that I'd come to appreciate. She took one look at Marcus, still sitting in the chair beside my bed, and her expression shifted slightly. "Good morning, Mrs. Osborne. How are you feeling?" she asked, her professional demeanor firmly in place. "Ready for the procedure?" I said. "Excellent. We'll be taking you down to the lab in about 30 minutes. I want to review the—" She paused, glancing at Marcus. "Is this your son?" "Yes, this is Marcus." Dr. Patel extended her hand. "I'm Dr. Patel. I'll be performing your mother's procedure this morning." Marcus shook her hand briefly, then released it. "I need to speak with you about my mother's condition," he said. "The real cause." Dr. Patel's expression remained neutral, but I saw her jaw tighten slightly. "Of course. Why don't we step into the hallway?" I watched them leave, my heart rate spiking on the monitor. Through the small window in the door, I could see Marcus gesturing animatedly while Dr. Patel listened with her arms crossed. At one point, she shook her head firmly. Then she was back in the room, alone. "Your son seems to have some alternative theories about your condition," she said carefully. "I want to assure you that the tests we've run are conclusive. You have significant blockages in your coronary arteries. Without intervention, you're at high risk for a major cardiac event. The procedure we're about to perform is standard, safe, and necessary." "I know," I said. "I trust you." "Good, because I need you to be very clear about something." She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "If your son or anyone else tries to prevent you from receiving medical treatment, that's a form of abuse. You have the right to medical care. You have the right to make your own decisions about your health. Do you understand?" I nodded, though I wasn't sure I did understand. Not really. How could my own son be abusing me? How could the boy I'd loved and raised be someone I needed protection from? The procedure went smoothly. Dr. Patel placed 2 stents in my coronary arteries and explained afterward that the blockages had been more severe than the initial imaging suggested. If I'd waited much longer, I would have had a major heart attack. The intervention had likely saved my life. I was back in my room by early afternoon, groggy from the sedation and sore from the catheterization site. Marcus was waiting, along with Sister Evangeline and the other church members. They'd apparently spent the morning in the hospital chapel, praying for my spiritual salvation. "How do you feel?" Marcus asked, his expression hovering between concern and something else, something calculating. "Tired," I said truthfully. "The doctors say the procedure went well." "That's what they would say," Sister Evangeline interjected. "But true healing comes from within, from the spirit." "The flesh is temporary, Mrs. Osborne. Your soul is what matters." I didn't have the energy to argue. The medication they'd given me for the procedure was still coursing through my system, making everything feel slightly unreal. I closed my eyes and wished they would all leave. But they didn't. They stayed through dinner, through the evening visiting hours, through the night. Marcus took the chair again. Sister Evangeline and the others rotated in and out, always leaving at least one person present. By the second night, I realized they weren't going to leave. They were settling in. They were making a claim on me. On the third day in the hospital, Dr. Patel came by to check on my recovery. The stent placement had gone well. My cardiac markers were improving. She wanted to keep me for one more night for observation, then send me home with a new medication regimen and strict instructions for cardiac rehabilitation. "You'll need to take it easy for the next few weeks," she explained. "No heavy lifting, no strenuous exercise, but light walking, healthy diet, stress management, these are all important. I'm going to refer you to our cardiac rehabilitation program. They'll help you rebuild your strength safely." "Thank you," I said. "For everything." She hesitated, then pulled a chair close to my bed. "Mrs. Osborne, I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. Are you safe at home?" The question caught me off guard. "Safe? Of course." "Why would you ask that?" "Because I've been in medicine for 30 years, and I've seen patterns. Your son has been very vocal about his belief that you're possessed. He's been telling other patients in the waiting room about demonic influence. He's been trying to convince staff members that your cardiac disease is actually a spiritual problem. He's been very persistent about preventing you from receiving medical care." I opened my mouth to defend Marcus, then closed it again. Because what Dr. Patel was describing was true. All of it was true. "I don't know what to do about it," I admitted quietly. "You have options," Dr. Patel said. "You could speak with our social worker. You could file a report about interference with medical care. You could involve Adult Protective Services. But first, you need to decide what you want to do. This is your life, your body, your health. No one else gets to make those decisions for you." After she left, I lay in the hospital bed and stared at the ceiling tiles. I'd spent my entire adult life taking care of other people. As a nurse, I'd cared for patients. As a mother, I'd cared for Marcus. As a daughter, I'd eventually cared for my own mother before she passed away 5 years ago. I'd always put everyone else's needs before my own. It had seemed like the right thing to do, the noble thing. But lying there, facing the reality that my own son was trying to prevent me from receiving life-saving medical care, I wondered if I'd made a terrible mistake. I wondered if my selflessness had enabled him to become selfish. If my sacrifice had taught him that he could demand anything from me, and I would comply. That afternoon, I made a decision. When Marcus arrived for his evening vigil, I asked him to sit down. Sister Evangeline and the others were downstairs in the cafeteria, giving us privacy. For the first time in days, we were alone. "I need you to listen to me very carefully," I said. "I'm going to say this once, and I need you to understand that I mean every word." Marcus's expression shifted. He could sense the change in my tone. "I have a cardiac disease. It's a real disease. It's caused by real physiological problems. The doctors have treated it with real medicine, and that medicine has saved my life. I will not accept any alternative explanations for my condition. I will not accept any spiritual interventions. I will not allow you or anyone from your church to interfere with my medical care." "Mother," he started, but I held up my hand. "I'm not finished. I love you. I will always love you. But I cannot support this path you're on. I cannot pretend that your church is helping you when I can see that it's isolating you and turning you into someone I don't recognize." The boy I raised was kind and thoughtful and capable of changing his mind when presented with evidence. "You're not that boy anymore, and I don't know how to reach you." Marcus's face had gone very still. "The church warned me that you would say things like this, that the demon would speak through you, trying to convince me to abandon my spiritual journey." "I'm not a demon, Marcus. I'm your mother, and I'm asking you to please get help. Real help. From a therapist who can help you understand why you've become so dependent on this church and these people." He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with a sound that made me flinch. "I came here to save you, and you're rejecting that salvation. That's your choice. But know that I will be telling everyone at church about this. I will be telling them that you've rejected God's intervention, that you've chosen the path of darkness. Tell them whatever you need to tell them," I said, my voice steady even though my heart was racing dangerously fast. The monitors beside my bed began beeping more rapidly, reflecting my elevated pulse. "But you need to leave now. I don't want you in this room." For a moment, I thought he might argue further. But then something shifted in his expression. He looked at me like I was a stranger, like the person lying in that hospital bed was no longer his mother, but something else entirely. Something he no longer recognized or cared about. "I'll tell Sister Evangeline you've asked us to leave," he said coldly. "But this isn't over, Mother. The church will continue to pray for your soul." He walked out without another word. I watched him go, then pressed the call button for the nurse. When she arrived, I asked her to make a note in my chart that my son was not to be allowed in my room without my explicit permission. The nurse, a kind woman named Rebecca, who'd been taking care of me for the past 2 days, didn't ask questions. She simply nodded and made the notation. "You're doing the right thing," she said quietly. "I've seen a lot of families go through situations like this. You have to protect yourself." I spent my last night in the hospital alone, which was exactly what I needed. I didn't sleep much, but I did think. I thought about the choices I'd made as a parent. I thought about the ways I might have inadvertently enabled Marcus's isolation and vulnerability to the church's influence. I thought about Cassandra and how she'd tried to warn me. I thought about the future and what it might look like without my son in it. By morning, I'd cried myself out. My eyes were swollen, my throat raw, but something inside me had crystallized into resolve. I was going to survive this. I was going to recover from my cardiac disease. And I was going to figure out how to live with the knowledge that my own son had tried to prevent me from doing so. Dr. Patel came by to discharge me. She gave me detailed instructions about my medications, my rehabilitation program, my follow-up appointments. She also gave me a business card for a social worker and another for a therapist who specialized in family estrangement. "Take care of yourself," she said. "And remember what I told you about your rights. Don't let anyone, family or otherwise, interfere with your medical care." I went home to my small house in the suburbs, the place I'd lived for 23 years. The place where I'd raised Marcus, where I'd hosted countless family dinners, where I'd built a life. It felt different now, quieter, emptier, but also somehow safer. The first week was the hardest. I was physically weak from the procedure and the hospitalization. My chest ached where the catheter had been inserted. My medications made me dizzy and nauseated, but I pushed through the cardiac rehabilitation program, walking a little further each day, slowly rebuilding my strength. And then, on the 9th day after my discharge, my phone rang. It was Cassandra. "Mom, I heard from Marcus's church," she said without preamble. "They're telling people that you're possessed and that you've rejected their attempts to save you. They're saying that you're a warning to the community about the dangers of spiritual blindness." I closed my eyes. Part of me had known this was coming. Part of me had been bracing for it. "He told them everything," Cassandra continued. "About the hospital? About your refusal of their help? About how you've aligned yourself with the medical establishment instead of God? Mom, they're talking about you like you're evil, like you're some kind of cautionary tale." "I know," I said quietly. "I told him to leave the hospital. I told him I didn't want him interfering with my medical care." This is his response. "This is insane," Cassandra said, her voice rising. "He's slandering you. He's telling lies about your health, about your character, about your spiritual state. Have you considered legal action? Against my own son? I don't know, Cassandra. I don't know what I'm doing anymore." But even as I said it, I knew that wasn't quite true. I did know. I'd known since the moment I'd asked Marcus to leave the hospital. I just hadn't wanted to admit it to myself. Over the next few weeks, the situation escalated in ways I hadn't anticipated. Marcus's church, which I later learned was called the Church of Spiritual Awakening, had a significant social media presence. They began posting about spiritual warfare and demonic resistance to divine intervention. While they didn't mention me by name, the details were specific enough that anyone who knew me could figure out who they were talking about. A woman in her 60s. Recently hospitalized. Rejecting spiritual healing in favor of worldly medicine. People I'd known for decades started treating me differently. Some avoided me entirely. Others approached me with expressions of exaggerated concern, asking if I was okay and if I'd considered alternative approaches to my health. One woman from my old church, a place I hadn't attended in years, actually tried to give me literature about faith healing. I was becoming a pariah in my own community. Not because of anything I'd done, but because my son had decided I was possessed and had broadcast that decision to everyone who would listen. 3 weeks into my recovery, I received a certified letter. It was from Marcus's church, addressed to me but clearly drafted by someone with legal training. The letter outlined their concerns about my spiritual state and their desire to perform a comprehensive spiritual evaluation and intervention. It went on to list specific dates and times when church representatives would be visiting my home to conduct this evaluation. It was phrased politely, but the underlying message was clear. They were coming whether I wanted them to or not. I called Dr. Patel's office and asked to speak with the social worker she'd recommended. Her name was Sandra, and she was available to meet with me the following day. Sandra's office was small and warm, decorated with plants and soft lighting. She was a woman in her 50s with gray streaked hair and kind eyes. She listened to my entire story without interrupting, taking notes occasionally, but mostly just listening. "What you're describing is a form of coercion," she said when I'd finished. "The letter they sent you is particularly concerning. It's essentially a threat, dressed up in polite language. They're telling you that they're going to come to your home and perform a procedure on you, whether you consent or not. That's not okay." "What can I do?" I asked. "Several things," Sandra said. "First, you can file a restraining order against Marcus and the church. You can document the harassment, the social media posts, the letter, the behavior at the hospital. You can report them to Adult Protective Services for attempting to interfere with your medical care. You can also file a police report for harassment and coercion." "But he's my son," I said, the words sounding hollow even to my own ears. "I know," Sandra said gently, "and that makes this harder. But your son is an adult making adult choices. He's choosing to align himself with an organization that's attempting to control your medical care and your life. That's not something you're responsible for. That's not something you can fix by being more accommodating or more understanding. He needs to make different choices." I left Sandra's office with a folder full of information and a sense of grim determination. I wasn't going to let my son or his church dictate my health care or my life. I'd spent too many years taking care of everyone else to spend my remaining years being controlled by someone who claimed to want to save me. I filed the restraining order first. I documented everything: the hospital incident, the social media posts, the letter from the church. A judge reviewed the evidence and granted a temporary restraining order, which would become permanent if Marcus didn't contest it. He didn't. According to the court paperwork, he filed a response claiming that he was acting in my best interest and that the restraining order was an attempt to prevent him from saving my soul. The judge was not moved by this argument. The permanent restraining order was granted on a Tuesday morning. Marcus was legally prohibited from contacting me, coming to my home, or attempting to influence my medical care. The order also named the Church of Spiritual Awakening as a co-respondent, meaning they were also prohibited from attempting to contact me or perform any interventions on my person. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I felt like I'd just severed a limb. That evening, I called Cassandra and told her what had happened. She was quiet for a long moment. "I'm proud of you, Mom," she said finally. "I know that wasn't easy." "I don't feel proud," I said. "I feel like I've failed. Like I failed him somehow, and now I'm being punished for it." "You didn't fail him," Cassandra said firmly. "He made choices, bad choices, and now he's facing consequences for those choices. That's not your fault. That's not your responsibility." But it felt like my responsibility. It felt like everything was my responsibility. The next few months were strange. The social media posts about me continued, but they became less frequent as the church moved on to other targets. The people in my community who'd been treating me differently gradually returned to their normal behavior, or at least close to it. Some relationships had been permanently damaged, but most people seemed to accept that this wasn't really my problem to solve. I threw myself into my cardiac rehabilitation. I walked 3 miles every morning. I followed my diet religiously. I took my medications exactly as prescribed. I attended my follow-up appointments with Dr. Patel and gradually watched my cardiac function improve. 6 months after my hospitalization, my ejection fraction was back to normal. The stents were holding. I was, by all medical measures, thriving, but emotionally, I was struggling in ways I didn't quite know how to process. I started therapy with a woman named Dr. Morrison, who specialized in family estrangement and religious trauma. We talked about my relationship with Marcus, about the ways I'd enabled his isolation by being too accepting and not questioning his choices early enough. We talked about guilt and responsibility, and the difference between caring for someone and sacrificing yourself for them. You can't save people who don't want to be saved, Dr. Morrison told me during one session. Your son is an adult. He's made choices about his life and his beliefs. Those choices have led him to a place where he's willing to harm you in order to validate those beliefs. That's not something you caused. That's not something you can fix. But he's my son, I said again, the words becoming a kind of mantra. I know, Dr. Morrison said. And you love him? But love doesn't mean accepting abuse. Love doesn't mean allowing someone to control your medical care or your life. Love sometimes means saying no. Love sometimes means walking away. A year after my hospitalization, I received a letter from Marcus. It was handwritten, on plain white paper, and it arrived at my house on a Tuesday morning. The restraining order had expired 6 months earlier. I'd chosen not to renew it, hoping that time and distance might have changed something in my son. The letter suggested that perhaps I'd been wrong to hope. Dear Mother, it began. I've been praying about you every day. The church has helped me understand that my attempts to save you were an act of love, even if you couldn't recognize it as such. I still believe that you're spiritually lost, and I still believe that the only way for you to find true peace is through the church. However, I also respect your choice to reject that path. I pray that someday you'll understand what we were trying to do, and that you'll come back to us. Your son, Marcus. I read the letter 3 times. Each time, I looked for something I could hold on to. Some indication that the boy I'd raised was still in there somewhere. But all I found was the same circular logic, the same inability to acknowledge that his actions had been harmful, the same conviction that he'd been right all along. I didn't respond to the letter. I filed it away with the other documents related to this period of my life, and I continued living. 2 years after my hospitalization, I was sitting in my living room on a Saturday morning, reading the newspaper and drinking coffee, when my phone rang. It was Dr. Patel's office. My annual cardiac checkup was scheduled for the following week, and they were calling to confirm. Of course, I told the receptionist. I'll be there. But as I hung up the phone, I realized something had shifted inside me. The checkup didn't fill me with dread anymore. It filled me with gratitude. Gratitude that I'd listened to my doctors. Gratitude that I'd refused to let my son's beliefs override my own judgment. Gratitude that I was still here, still alive, still thriving. I thought about Marcus sometimes. I wondered if he was happy, if he was still involved with the church, if he ever thought about me and regretted the choices he'd made. But I didn't wonder in a way that kept me up at night anymore. I didn't wonder in a way that made me question my own decisions. I'd learned something important during this process. I'd learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to refuse to enable their destructive behavior. I'd learned that protecting yourself isn't selfish, it's necessary. I'd learned that you can love someone and still walk away from them. Cassandra came to visit for my birthday that year. We sat on my back porch, looking out at the garden I'd spent the last 2 years cultivating. It was full of flowers now, roses and peonies and lavender. It was beautiful and thriving and entirely mine. Do you ever regret it? Cassandra asked. The restraining order, cutting him off? I thought about that carefully. I regret that it was necessary, I said finally. I regret that my son became someone who would try to prevent his mother from receiving life-saving medical care. I regret that his church has such a hold on him. But do I regret protecting myself? No, I don't regret that at all. Good, Cassandra said. She reached over and squeezed my hand. Because you deserve to protect yourself. You deserve to live. That night, after Cassandra had gone to bed, I sat alone in my living room and thought about everything that had happened. The hospital, the restraining order, the letter from Marcus, the long process of learning to live with the fact that my son had become someone I couldn't reach. I thought about all the years I'd spent putting everyone else's needs before my own. I thought about all the ways I'd sacrificed and compromised and accepted less than I deserved. And I thought about how, in the end, it had taken a medical crisis to teach me that I was worth protecting. I picked up my phone and called Dr. Patel's office. When the receptionist answered, I asked to schedule an additional appointment. Not because anything was wrong, but because I wanted to thank my doctor for standing firm when my son was trying to convince her that I was possessed. I wanted to thank her for reminding me that I had rights, that I had agency, that my life and my health were worth fighting for. The receptionist seemed surprised by the request, but she scheduled the appointment anyway. A week later, I sat across from Dr. Patel in her office. She looked pleased to see me. Your cardiac function is excellent, she said, reviewing my latest test results. Your medications are working well. You're doing everything right. How are you feeling? I'm feeling good, I said. Actually, I came in today to thank you for everything you did during my hospitalization, for standing up to my son and his church, for reminding me that I had a choice. Dr. Patel smiled. I'm glad I could help. But you did the hard part. You made the difficult choice. You protected yourself. That took courage. It took a lot of things, I said. It took losing my son. It took becoming a pariah in my community for a while. It took facing the fact that I'd spent my entire life taking care of everyone else and not taking care of myself. But yes, I suppose it took courage too. How are you doing with all of that? Dr. Patel asked. I'm getting there, I said. Some days are harder than others, but I'm alive, I'm healthy, and I'm learning that those things matter more than I ever realized. As I left Dr. Patel's office that day, I felt something shift inside me. Not physically. My heart was steady. My blood pressure was normal. My cardiac markers were all in the right range. But emotionally, something had settled into place. I'd spent so much of my life trying to be what everyone else needed me to be. A good nurse, a devoted mother, a self-sacrificing daughter, a woman who put everyone else's needs before her own, and in doing so, I'd allowed myself to become vulnerable to someone who would use that selflessness against me. But I was learning a new way of being, a way that involved protecting myself, a way that involved saying no, a way that involved recognizing that my life, my health, my well-being were worth fighting for. Not in a selfish way, but in a way that acknowledged my own inherent value. I didn't know if Marcus would ever understand this. I didn't know if he would ever leave his church or come to see the harm he'd caused. I didn't know if there was any possibility of reconciliation in our future, but I did know that I was going to be okay. I was going to survive this. I was going to thrive, and that, I realized, was enough. 3 years after my hospitalization, I received word through Cassandra that Marcus had left the Church of Spiritual Awakening. Apparently, he'd questioned something the church leadership said, and they'd responded by ostracizing him. He was now trying to rebuild his life outside the church and had started seeing a therapist. Cassandra asked if I wanted to reach out to him. I thought about it carefully. I thought about the boy he'd been and the man he'd become. I thought about the pain he'd caused me and the choices he'd made. I thought about forgiveness and reconciliation and what those things meant. And then I decided to send him a message. Not a long message, just a simple one. I'm glad you're getting help. I hope you're doing okay. I'm here if you ever want to talk. He didn't respond immediately, but 3 weeks later, he sent back a message. Thank you for saying that. I'm sorry for what I did. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I wanted you to know that I see it now. I see how wrong I was. I cried when I read that message. Not from joy, exactly, but from a kind of release. From the acknowledgement that my son was capable of growth and change. That perhaps there was a path forward, even if it looked different than I'd imagined. We didn't immediately reconcile. We didn't have a tearful reunion or pretend that everything was fine. But we did start talking again, slowly and carefully. We did begin the long process of rebuilding our relationship on new terms. Terms where I had boundaries. Terms where I protected myself. Terms where I was willing to let him in again, but only as far as I felt safe allowing. It wasn't the ending I would have chosen. It wasn't the simple story where the son realizes his mistake and comes home, and everything goes back to the way it was. But it was real, it was honest, and it was mine. Today, 5 years after my hospitalization, I'm sitting in my garden. The roses are blooming. The sun is warm on my face. My heart is strong, and I'm at peace with the choices I made, even though they cost me my relationship with my son for a time. I learned something important during those dark months. I learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is to say no. I learned that protecting yourself isn't selfish. I learned that your life, your health, your well-being are worth fighting for. And I learned that it's never too late to start putting yourself first. If you're in a situation where someone is trying to control your medical care or your life based on their beliefs, please know that you have options. Please know that you have rights. Please know that you deserve to protect yourself. Reach out to a doctor, a therapist, a social worker, or a lawyer. There are people who can help you. And there is a way forward, even when it feels impossible.